From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Critic Jed Pearl kindly wrote of the book in Harper's Magazine. These chapters are intended to have their own sort of thematic integrity, or rather essayistic, even though they're all building blocks in the whole thing. Now, I should say, of course, that if I'd allowed myself to follow all of my ideas as far as I could have, this book would have been half again the size, and my dear editor and sponsor, Roger Straus, who died 2 years ago at FSG, who sustained this project for 20 years, was always working on me to make it get smaller rather than bigger. So, of course, I was fighting back, but not succeeding, nor did I really want to overkill the subject by interpreting it. Now, this book is built up, as all biographies are, from hundreds of minute details. And of course, much of my material comes from books by Wilson, all of his journals, everything he wrote, and of equal value were interviews with Wilson's contemporaries who had known him when he was still alive. I even interviewed Wilson himself for 4 days way back in 1963 as a graduate student. I did not expect then to be a kind of substitute Boswell for Wilson, and it was clear that he did not particularly like the idea that anyone might be. But on the other hand, I learned some very useful things at the beginning of what was going to be my quest, or before it officially began. Now, a lot of material came from the Wilson archive at the Beinecke Library in New Haven. There one finds the original journals. I happen, thanks to Roger Straus's help, to own another set of the typed versions, and one finds many of the 70,000, believe it or not, letters that Wilson wrote in the course of his life. I found many of them exist in Xerox copies in the Beinecke Library because they were gathered by his wife and then not included in the collection of his letters. Others, however, are elsewhere, like some that were sent to me by Isaiah Berlin's executor, Mr. Henry Hyde from Oxford, and I, of course, sent him Wilson's letters to Berlin, and some are found in places like the Library of Congress. Now, you have a variety of collections containing letters to or from Wilson. For example, there's several letters from James M. Cain, whom Wilson had characterized as a hard-boiled detective story writer, and who didn't particularly mind this, and who wrote Wilson to say that he really liked To the Finland Station. So, I mean, little pieces of interest appear, and someone might do a note on that someday. There are 12 letters between Wilson and Justice Frankfurter, an old acquaintance whom Wilson had known at the New Republic when Frankfurter was very much on the liberal side. As you know, he became a conservative in his jurisprudence as a Supreme Court judge. And he recused himself when Wilson's book, Memoirs of Hecate County, was banned in New York. The case got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court divided 4-4. That meant the lower courts got to sustain the ban on Wilson's book. And Wilson thought that Felix should not have taken himself out of it, but have fought for intellectual liberty. But in their later years, they corresponded, and I presume that's what this correspondence is about, because Wilson was working on his Civil War book, and one of the big figures in that book is Justice Holmes. And he was learning as much as he could from every source about Justice Holmes, and of course, Frankfurter had known Holmes. So then there's lots here that people could look into that's more interesting than maybe a brief summary would make it. Your most important collection for Wilson is that of Edna St. Vincent Millay, and I want to say something about this, though I actually read these letters before they became part of your holdings. They've never been quoted from before my book, and others will come here to read them. I should first say, in passing, that I don't share the view of Millay's biographers that she was the great woman in Wilson's life. I think this is much exaggerated. But she certainly affected everything that would happen to him, because she initiated him very romantically and then said something, he remembered it in his last years in the Journal of the 60s, said something like, well, love is wonderful. It was here and now it's gone. And of course she was. in a flash, and all of this was very hard for our rather heavy-handed, brilliant young man who suffered at his classic heartbreak, and then, after a few months, perhaps the better part of a year, got over it. But he did indeed go on to make a bad, unfortunate first marriage to a woman whom he got pregnant and didn't want to have an abortion, and an unfortunate second marriage to a woman who he married because he didn't want to get someone else pregnant. So you can argue that Wilson's experience with Millay, in some sense, made it harder for him to make appropriate marital choices, at any rate for 10 or 15 years. And what he said about all this was, for my time, love was heartbreak, the love that faded out or that you had to lose. And in these letters here, which are quite interesting, Wilson ends by saying to Edna, who has deserted him after this intense experience, that if he is the lover of 100 women, her memory will continue to hurt his heart. And he cries out that she has broken down the solitude in which his literary self had been formed. You have taken down the prison where my flame was burning, and how, if you leave me or forget me, shall I ever get it back in its prison and make it burn steadily alone? Well, I think wise persons in this room can see why I didn't want to overread that. It's brilliantly stated, but all the boys felt that way about Edna. As a very, very old lady said to me, using that phrase, all the boys. And a lady who was so old, in her 90s by that time, that all she remembered about Edna otherwise was that she used to come by the office of Vanity Fair with pink galoshes. Now, in the story behind the story, you should probably know that I was beginning my book when I found this letter in the back room of a New York lawyer named Solomon Glushak, who had once studied Shakespeare at Columbia, my university, and let me Xerox it. It did prepare me for the fact that Wilson wouldn't have very good marital adjustments. Before I leave that subject, I should say that his second wife, Margaret Canby, was really in love with Wilson. He married her because he thought it was the smart and appropriate thing to do, and it was a mistake for them both. But his marriage to Mary McCarthy, which is famous, turned very bitter for both of them eventually, partly because he was oppressive, also because she was profoundly neurotic in relation to authority figures. If you've read Memoirs of a Catholic Girlhood, a great memoir, you will know why, because unlike all these people today who talk about being constantly abused, Mary was very badly abused by foster parents and beaten and beaten. So anyway, there were problems there, and Wilson wasn't happily married until wonderful Elena Mumm, a Russo-German aristocrat, and he hooked up together. She looked after him, and they had what Malcolm Cowley, not minimizing the possibilities for quarrel or Wilson's capacity to strain any woman's patience, what Malcolm Cowley referred to as a lasting domestic accord. Now, to turn to the next subject, but before I leave Millay, I want to add that at a moment when I needed this in far-off Laramie, Alice Burney of your American section graciously dug up and copied for me one letter to Edna from Wilson's close friend, the poet John Peel Bishop, that I hadn't seen. And this was helpful because Bishop and Wilson had exactly the same experience. They were each run over by a truck named Edna. But Wilson recovered, and Bishop apparently never did. He was a weaker figure. He didn't have the same kind of mind as Wilson. And he thought he was, let's say, without being vulgar about it, something of a ladies' man, maybe even a bit of a stud, and the fact that Edna was not too deeply impressed by him and somewhat exploited him hurt Bishop more than Wilson's discovery that the world is a cruel place hurt him. But I was very grateful to Alice for sending me that letter. I had learned about it from Wilson's other recent biographer, Daniel Mark Epstein, who mentioned the letter, and without telling me about it and with Alice's help, I was able to get it. For one reason or another, though, the letters from Wilson to Millay himself were not used by Norma Millay in her biography of Wilson. She had told me they were dynamite, but when that biography appeared after 20 years, its shape had much changed. And they did not appear in the collection called Wilson, the Man in Letters. So I'm reasonably sure that they will be read here. Now, I think I'll just end the Wilson-Millay thing with an anecdote which you'll appreciate. When he stole a kiss behind a bush on the Cape that summer, he said to Edna that they would be two of the most interesting people in the United States when they were 50. To which the apostle of spontaneous youth replied, "You behave as if you were 50 already." Now, what's interesting here, life is complex and can be sad, is that Wilson was right about himself, and by the time she was 50, Millay had long faded, but Wilson remained loyal to her as a critic and as a friend, and his memoir of Millay, written after her death, is one of the pieces that people who love Wilson's work but think it's sometimes a little steely, particularly enjoy because of its profound feeling. Now, I want to turn to another collection, that of a Russian expatriate businessman and bibliophile named Roman Greenberg. And I'm not going to ask Alice, put her on the spot, to say if she knows how to pronounce the Russian name of Greenberg's unpronounceable Russian magazine, which he published out of his New York apartment during the from the 40s into the 60s. But I heard about these letters from another biographer named Stacy Schiff, whom you may have heard of because she's written something about Franklin in Paris now, who was then writing about Vera Nabokov. I was able to give her some help, and Stacy told me about these letters. And here I found Greenberg's and Wilson's in the Beinecke Library in New Haven, and putting them together, I learned something interesting about Wilson's relationship to Nabokov. And my thesis in dealing with the Wilson-Nabokov material, which is certainly one of the things that people know best about from the later years of Wilson's life, because Nabokov was a famous man, obviously, and became more famous than Wilson, was that their friendship turned into a disastrous feud after Nabokov translated Pushkin's great play, great novel in verse, Eugene Onegin, something like that, and Wilson ridiculed the translation in a review, ridicule in which he was utterly justified, but he then overplayed his hand by trying to criticize Nabokov's Russian and was taken to pieces by the novelist in a quarrel that everybody sort of enjoyed reading, in which these two men were kind of hurting themselves for the delectation of readers of the letters columns. But the background of all of this, I realized, might be in Wilson's response to Lolita. I don't know, but I assume there's some people here who in their misspent youth have read Lolita. And I think I ought to tell you that it came out partly came out of an appendix to Havelock Ellis's Psychology of Sex. Does anyone remember those brown volumes, which were then, at least in my youth and certainly in Wilson's, available only to doctors? You used to see them on the walls. Well, and I'm sure many is the teenager who has peeked at the case histories in very small type at the back. And Wilson, of course, had peeked, and he knew about something, and he sent to Nabokov a confession of a Ukrainian who suffered from Humbert's malady in relation to young girls and could not get over it and felt that it was morally destroying him. So he had written to the great psychologist about this. And Wilson sent Nabokov some 90 pages or so on this subject, which, of course, the Russian used in developing the whole theme of Lolita, and Wilson wasn't too pleased with it when Nabokov eagerly sent it to him, saying it's my best piece of work in English, which, of course, it was. However, Wilson had grown up in a different world, and from Wilson's point of view, it was all very well to write about sex with, what do we call them, consenting adults, and offend the bourgeoisie by describing exactly what happened, as well as you could, and even a little mechanically, because that made it more fun if you're a writer of the 20s, but it wasn't necessarily okay to do this about a child. And he drew a line there, and he thought that Nabokov was perhaps on the wrong side. It was partly that I think you could argue in language that I think is a little on the sloganeering side, that Nabokov turns modernism into something postmodernist in that book. It isn't entirely serious, as we know. And at the same time, he gets away with a lot through that kind of formula. When Wilson had encountered this kind of thing, it was in Joyce, who used lots of words and talked about lots of things which middle-class people didn't want to talk about, but who basically believed in human beings and the human family and the average sensual person as the sort of great reality of life marching forward, and who wouldn't have had anything to do with Humbert. Or in Proust, who was himself led a very decadent life, which really distressed young Wilson when he found out about it. I mean, here is this man who's awfully close not only to homosexuality, but to a kind of sadistic homosexuality, who sells his mother's furniture to a bordello, Proust. But what did he do in his novel? He spent all of his life trying to write a great book which transcended time and the limitations of the lives we lead. So Wilson ended up thinking that Nabokov had exactly the same kind of determination and great artistic will, but that on some level Lolita was second rate. He never said this to his friend, and he merely said, I don't like it, I'll recommend it to other people if you want. But Nabokov really never got over his distress at this, which set him up, of course, to be violently offended when Wilson rejected what Nabokov thought was his real life's work, which was this translation of Pushkin, which itself is an unreadable translation accompanied by brilliant notes. But anyway, this is the background for their quarrel, and what I found in a couple of letters here, and I'll just read you tiny fragments so that you can see what I got out of it. Wilson knew he might not have done justice to Lolita. This is from his letter to someone else. He expected Nabokov to accept his wish that he could like the book better and move on. And in the correspondence, Nabokov at first tries to do so. To Roman Greenberg in 1955, however, Wilson reported, he makes a great grievance of my not liking it. And the next year, we have Wilson getting a little complacent himself. He writes to Greenberg after a visit to Ithaca and Nabokov that though Lolita rather put me off him, he was glad to get an opportunity to get to like him again. Well, that's fine for Wilson, but how do you think Nabokov felt? See? So I picked up certain nuances from letters here that in a very small way helped me be sure that I wasn't exaggerating the role that Lolita had in setting up the later huge quarrel between these friends. Now, I need to move along, and I want to say that to give you an example of the interviews that I used from people who had known Wilson, since we're talking about him and Nabokov, there I could draw on the memories of Harry Levin, who was the long-term head of Comp Lit at Harvard and whose wife Elena was Russian. Levin told me that Nabokov informed Wilson that the October Revolution had made his life, and I quote here, a fool's. Politically and morally irrelevant. That is, I couldn't do anything that really mattered after the revolution. And that is what lawyers call hearsay. Wilson didn't tell me this. He was long dead. But in fact, it makes sense in terms of one's feeling about Nabokov, about Lolita. There's a quality there, isn't there, of sex sort of making up for the irrelevance of history, the fact that you can't really do anything about the important things. I had this experience once as a young man. I was in Poland giving some lectures vaguely affiliated with the Fulbright Commission, and I can remember that this was in the 1960s. I can remember that the Poles were really pretty hipped up on sex, and I can remember feeling that this had a lot to do with the fact that there was no political freedom at all, that there was some sort of libidinal cross in that. I remember, I'll never forget arriving at the Hotel Europejski to have a drink with the English professor who was ostensibly my host, though we never didn't see each other at all after that, who told me he was so sorry he couldn't invite me for an orgy at his house, but his wife was in town. That was sort of the atmosphere, and there's a little bit like that if you feel that Nabokov felt as though somehow, especially when he came to America and established himself here, as though somehow he was cut off from what had made his life historically and politically most important, and I think Lolita was a brilliant effort to fill that vacuum. Now, the other thing that Levin told me, which was useful for Wilson and Nabokov, was that he had been present when Wilson complained of a sample of Nabokov's translation of Onegin. Volodya, there's no continuity from sentence to sentence, which, of course, is exactly what Wilson said in print when this translation, intended to be a literal translation, written without the sort of continuity that we give things, appeared. And unfortunately, although a literal translation, as Isaiah Berlin pointed out to me when we discussed this, Nabokov fancied up the language so much by trying to use more complex words and not just, and get something that was the ultimate nuance, so you don't call it a monkey. You know what you call it? A sapajou, which is some kind of old English word for some kind of special monkey that they had in Russia. So anyway, I was able to learn a lot from a personal source there. I want to give you briefly a personal source that I was not in need of using. Hume Cronin, who died a couple of years ago, and I think you attended his funeral in New York, has a collection here that has a few interesting things in it, but I was able to catch up with him in person, and he told me how he and Jessica Tandy had put on Wilson's play The Little Blue Light at Harvard in 1950. They believed in the play, though it needed cutting, and they struggled to persuade someone Cronin remembered as a likable but frighteningly erudite author, that not everything in a play needed to be on the page. And Cronin gave me an unforgettable glimpse of Wilson on opening night in his white linen suit, nervous about everything, and, as he said, sitting against a wall, entirely compos mentis, but drunk, because he just could not face what was going to happen. Doubtless he was perhaps thinking of the experience that Henry James, a great American author of prose, had when he decided to become a playwright, and his play Guy Domville appeared in 1895, and James, as those of us who love James or know literary history have to tenderly remember, was literally hooted from the stage. His play was so bad, and there were a lot of people who'd been brought, sort of like some of my friends here, to swell the applause, but there were a lot of other people who'd paid for their seats who thought it was lousy, and they told the people who were brought to swell the applause to be quiet and shouted James off the stage. So Wilson was lucky. His play was open for 2 weeks. Now, at the other extreme, from such a colorful minor detail of the life, along the way in my book, I try to do justice to a number of Wilson's lasting critical essays. I don't have time to go into these now, and it's not directly appropriate to the Library of Congress, but I think that I agree with the British critic Frank Kermode, who told me that he thought Americans were not literary enough, he didn't quite say literate enough, he was careful, today to pay as much attention as they should to Wilson's critical essays. And I certainly am paying attention to them and have ideas about ways in which they can be brought home to people. Certainly everyone who is interested in literary criticism has read at least one essay of Wilson's, whether it be the great Dickens essay in The Wound and the Bow, his correction of Hemingway in Mid-Passage, the early wonderful essays on Haussmann and Flaubert and Bernard Shaw, or even the Joyce and Proust back in Axel's Castle and certain reviews of his American contemporaries. There is a marvelous essay, if you like him, on Turgenev, that people don't know very well. That's worth reading. I want to call attention to this, and of course the brilliant essay on Philoctetes, Sophocles' play. In this essay, Wilson reads the relationship between the artist and society and the complicated issue of whether artists are in some respects neurotic or dysfunctional, and whether this can have something to do with the power of their work. He reads it in a dramatic way, and therefore it was important for me in terms of Wilson's life as well as the work. Now, what I haven't time for now, but I just want you to know it's here in case people don't come up with any good questions, which I hope you will, I'll inflict this last stitch on you. It has to do with the very great value for Americans of Wilson's biographical histories. Finland Station and Patriotic Gore have been very influential in this country within the last 30 or 40 years. People still care about Finland Station. In fact, when I gave a talk at the Boston Athenaeum several weeks ago, somebody came up to me and said, somehow Finland Station has arrived at Harvard and all the students are buying it. And we know that Patriotic Gore was very influential in this country when it came out in the 60s because it was a curious, interesting comment on the movement of what people at that time were thinking of as the Civil War celebration. Wilson thought that the Civil War was very unfortunate, thinking of all the people who were killed and of the fact that in the short run it didn't do a great deal of good, at any rate in the short run, for the African Americans who ended up being one of the objects of the war. And what Wilson feared and hated about the Civil War was not so much that war itself, but its resonance in making Americans feel, as Wilson had observed in our 20th century wars, that we are more moral than other people and that our wars are always for high objectives. And of course, he very much disputed this. And I'll leave you with this thought because there is a little quatrain that Wilson wrote way back in World War I at the graves of American soldiers in France, which shows you how deeply he took with this and suggests why he would come back and write a different kind of history than To the Finland Station, a kind of history in which myths are being viewed rather skeptically, and people live through them without necessarily knowing quite what they believe or why. And in this category, Wilson shows us Lincoln, Grant, Sherman, Harriet Beecher Stowe. The only person who really always knew what he was doing was Justice Holmes, but he lost his early ideals in the war, in which he was 4 times wounded and had a very grim view of life as a result of this. But I want you to know, just to think about this author writing such a book as that, thinking as we do today about our government declaring mission accomplished on board a certain carrier. I imagine there's some people in this room who know what the carrier's name was, the USS Abraham Lincoln. Not entirely a coincidence. Wilson wrote in his youth of these dead servicemen a quatrain. All stubborn and obscene, they toiled in pain. Go, countrymen of theirs, they bought you pride. Look to it, the Republic, leave not vain the deaths of those who knew not why they died. That's the Gettysburg Address upside down, isn't it? Wilson had to be deeply moved by the Gettysburg Address, but he wanted us to not leave these deaths vain. And I don't think he would have been happy with the thought that the only way to not leave them vain, as in our present life situation, Iraq, whatever, is just to go on and make as much more destruction as we have to. So what I'm saying here is that any great author has ways in which he or she becomes relevant to you at particular moments in time. There are a lot of other things that Wilson is probably more important for than that particular kind of anti-war stance, which is a minor part of that great book. But I think it shows you why he's relevant and why we go to major writers, because they do help us to negotiate life in the way that Wilson thought that art should do. So. Now, I don't know if I can leave the platform. I'm supposed to be in this picture. Can I go over here for a moment, or should I stay where I am, John? I'll come over here because this will allow people to shoot so their arrows more directly at the bearer. I felt quite isolated over there in those lights. So who would like to bring something up? It isn't, yes, please. I saw you having many thoughts there. I was pleased to see you talk about it.
When I was a director, on the Civil War front going on the 4th of July, I came here specifically to hear your comments about patriotic war, and I've been amply rewarded.
century. The only person whom I thought it didn't cross with, interestingly enough, was Faulkner, because Faulkner, as we all know, did not try to live in a metropolis or within a cultural scene. He went back to Oxford, Mississippi, and was loyal to what he called his little postage stamp of native soil, and therefore wrote the very great books that the rest of them did not produce, though they produced individually, Gatsby and The Sun Also Rises and so forth. And I thought Faulkner had nothing to do with Wilson, and then I found out that he had, because rather late in his career, Faulkner published a not quite first-rate book called Intruder in the Dust, which deals with the possibilities of a lynching. And Wilson reviewed this with some sympathy for Faulkner's attempt to evoke a better South than the actual South of the lynching by having a sort of chivalric old lawyer and a little boy and an old lady rushing around trying to get the evidence that would free this obviously innocent African American. But it was not Faulkner's one of Faulkner's great books, and his great period was behind him. And Wilson said so in a review, which had his usual capacity for disinterested sternness that his contemporaries accepted from him and from no one else. And I found in at Yale a letter from Faulkner in which he says, and I'm right now from the beginning, the points you make are good. And then he says, I had intended to make Gavin Stevens, the literary lawyer, you know, in there, the chivalric fellow, someone who would register with, as the kind of Southerner, and this I'm trying to paraphrase Faulkner, who had some position and sense of honor in and belief in his community and status in his community and could speak for it. And he said that I didn't really persuade you and Malcolm Cowley means that I failed. So Faulkner then was capable of real generosity. And he said something else that I found out about Edmund Wilson. It was somewhere in his lectures at the university. Faulkner was talking about the split in American culture and the lack of real importance of the imaginative life. And he talked about Malraux and doing things for de Gaulle, you know, which we all knew about. We lived through that. And then he said, I doubt if Charles E. Wilson, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of Defense, perfectly reasonable man from General Motors, who was not perhaps a brilliant person, but in that time was not doing any harm. He said, I doubt if Charles E. Wilson ever even knows who Edmund Wilson is, dash, ever heard of him. That was all that Faulkner had to say, but that gives you a sense of his role in his time. Other thoughts? Philip, I'm sure you have some good thoughts. My old friend and one-time college pal.
Right. Hardly. I was struck by, as a long-time teacher, by your comment that undergraduates would never have come across Wilson in a course. Can we change this? If you were to develop a course for undergraduates that delivered Wilson in an appropriate way and stimulated undergraduates to learn, where would you put it? What kind of a course would you put him in good mood?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think the problem is that unless this were part of some sort of NEH-type project, which on some level involved a carrot that was being extended to universities, to departments, or something like that, this would cut very much against the grain of the perfectly reasonable emphasis on race, class, and gender, and on theory in English departments today. Now, there are many people who do read Wilson in academia, but today I think they're inclined to perhaps be anthropologists, who are interested perhaps in his later work, American historians of ideas. I think it would be hard to get into an English department, except of course through an honors program or through some sort of specialized class in American studies. And the difficulty there is that Wilson's prose is complex, and what he does in his work is to work on the borderline between different genres. I mean, his are to the Finland Station and patriotic or biography or the history. Are Wilson's essays portraits, as they often are, or of men through their work, or are they accounts of the work? It's very difficult to put him in there, except of course the way that he will survive. He will survive because his prose is so good. And eventually, people will read. As William Shawn said to me, Wilson has one of the 6 best expository styles in this people who could in some ways defer to their more learned friend. The problem with this was that Nabokov was at least as learned as Wilson, and that he had an enormous ego which had been frustrated until he hit the jackpot with Lolita and became a world figure, as Wilson was not. Please.
Thank you. Did you have a relationship at all with Joseph Brodsky, Mr. Wilson's name?
No, and I would like to have. I had a relationship with Roger Straus, and when I would meet, Roger would sometimes tell me that he'd seen Brodsky and what Brodsky was doing. And Roger also loved Wilson, which I benefited from. But I never met Joseph Brodsky, and I don't know if Wilson had any cognizance of him, because in his late years, Wilson was not really, basically, his important stuff about Russian literature, the last of it is his great review of Pasternak in of Dr. Zhivago, which Simon Karlinsky, who says that Wilson, who agrees with Nabokov that Wilson exaggerated the merits of Dr. Zhivago, nonetheless thinks it's one of the great pieces by a non-Westerner about Russian literature. And I would say, what was interesting there, now we have to stop, so I'll wear you out. What was interesting there is that Nabokov was himself jealous of Pasternak because they were out at the same time. And Mrs. Nabokov was going around to bookstores, as I hope I can recruit my wife and other ladies to do, picking up his book and moving it to more conspicuous positions. And Nabokov really, really had no patience with Dr. Zhivago. It is a fine book. It's not a great novel, but what Nabokov couldn't stand was that in a limited sort of way, Pasternak makes the Soviet regime human. Hates it, but he makes it human. And for Nabokov, it's in. Please.
I have to have the last word there. I love patriotic gore so much, but usually I find it in bookstores in the literary criticism section. So I usually pick it up and I move it to the history section. And I've been doing that for the past 20 years.
Well, no, that's wonderful. I was in a bookstore with a very nice gentleman in New York City not long ago, and he found my book, not in the biography section, but under literary criticism. And they had 2 copies, which he proceeded to buy. So we must all be up to this. So you all have to look out for my interests.
I have to confess that when I get your book, I'm going to go to the section on Princess with the Golden Hair. You say something about that.
Absolutely. I do. And I will say something about it very briefly.
Right.
I believe that you should know that Edmund Wilson was capable of great wishing that he'd been a great novelist, and he'd like to think that Memoirs of Peckett County was perhaps his best book, and he'd like to think that The Princess with the Golden Hair was a wonderful story. I think The Princess with the Golden Hair is underrated. But I think that what makes it a great story, insofar as it is Wilson's journal of his relationship to Frances Minahan, as I call her, her proper name in my book, who became the honor, the working girl, the taxi dancer and waitress, who was his mistress off and on for several years. And I think that the other part of the book involving Imogen, the blonde lady, is sort of made up out of various people, and it's not as convincing as Wilson's documenting this sort of life, which was a life in bed, but also a life of hearts that beat together, because Frances was a very strong character and he loved her for it. So I think that's the best part of The Princess from my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. I'll just remind you of the authors, if you would like to be signed by Louis, and please put this one, bring it to the center of the book.
I will come by.
We'll have you back.
What I'll do is I'll embarrass Mr. Cole. I'll call him up from time to time and say, are there enough books there for me to come over and sign yet?
Thanks for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. I'd love to talk with you. I'm so glad that you like patriotic gore. It's ones at which a man named God.
Previously was the
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.